Welcome to part 2 of the Learn How to Play the Infinimist series, a video guide where I'm hoping to cover literally every single thing you could possibly need to know about this game as far as my understanding and my total knowledge of the Necromancer is at this point in Season 2 of Diablo 4. In our first video, we covered the basics, the history of the Infinimist build, where it came from, what inspired it, how it evolved into today's modern version of it from all the way back during the closed betas. And while I gave you a good amount of detail so you could walk away understanding how to pilot the build at the base level, along with the differences between basically the standard version, the X-Falls version or the crit version, and then the Black River or Corpse Explosion version of the build, in this video, I want to get into the insanely nitty-gritty, deep details about every single skill, every single aspect that interacts with those skills, every single unique item that interacts with those skills, and then all the different interactions between them, the damage systems in the game, the defense systems in the game, how this all kind of works together, so that you can literally decide every single piece of gear that you would put together to make the build function in the way that you want to. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You should absolutely use the timestamps down below, popping between each skill, because in each one of those sections I'm going to go over, like I said, every aspect, every unique, and how they all interplay. So if you've just been really interested to figure out whether or not Blood Soaked is exceptionally good when using Blood Mist in a speed farming setup, I'm going to have you covered there, so go use those timestamps. This is going to be a chunky video. I'm not exactly sure how long it's going to be, but it's definitely going to be one that you should bookmark and come back to when you need a refresher course on each one of these different interactions, aspects, skills, pieces of gear, or if you're just trying to digest it in multiple parts so that you can get all of that information into your cranium that I've managed to scrape together over thousands of hours of gameplay and testing at this point. So what we have here in a Necromancer Brady Bunch panel infographic that I've created is the basic skill bar of what the Infinimist Necromancer currently looks like. You obviously have Blood Mist, Bone Storm, Corpse Tendrils, and then you have Corpse Explosion and Decrepify. The question mark here is representative of the fact that your 6th skill actually has a huge amount of variance on this build, so that's where we're going to start. We're going to be covering the basic skills that can fit into this slot, the spender skills or core skills that can fit into this slot, a little interesting mechanism with Bone Spirit if you're nasty with it, and then most notably a double curse setup as well. This part of the video is probably going to take the longest because it's going to cover the most different skills, so if you already have your favorite one, I'm actually going to include sub timestamps to each one of them where we can cover how it's useful for the build. So just go ahead and check out that timestamp so you have a better idea of how that skill is supposed to be used on it before we get to the rest of the skills on the build. First up for the generator skills is Reap. This is the penultimate quintessential skill on the skill bar for Infinimist, and it's really easy to understand why this skill would be so valuable. Its ability to automatically generate a corpse on command, as well as being a darkness skill which deals shadow damage to be able to trigger all of our various passive skills and key passive in our skill tree, gives it an incredible amount of utility while also providing the most damage reduction in the game that you can get from a single skill use for the Necromancer. This kind of defines what the core strategy of an Infinimist Necromancer is. Generate corpses so that you can trigger crowd control effects, corpse explosions, and ultimately trigger all of your lucky hits and additional damage effective bonuses. So as I said before, Reap is going to generate a corpse once per 4 seconds if you were to use the skill continuously. It doesn't matter how many targets you hit with the skill, it will only ever generate one. The best part of this, though, is that it generates it the moment that it first hits a target, meaning that over a 4-second period, you can actually generate 2 corpses. You generate the first one to start the timer, and then 4 seconds later, you can generate your second one. Reap allows you to set up an engagement, meaning that you can choose to reap and generate a corpse so that you can then start with corpse tendrils. So while everything is being crowd controlled actively, you can apply Decrepify and then Blood Mist through them, not losing out on any of your Decrepify procs, and generally keeping the battlefield very clean and safe for the Necromancer to work inside of. From the skill tree alone, Reap is able to trigger an amazing amount of benefits for the Necromancer, starting off first with Hued Flesh for the ability to generate corpses, on top of its native ability to generate corpses itself. Enhanced Decrepify's ability to apply stun to a target affected by the curse, and similarly Abhorrent Decrepify's ability to reduce cooldowns from hitting targets who have been cursed. Reaper's Pursuit to gain an immediate boost of movement speed. Gloom to be able to increase damage dealt to a target that's been dealt shadow damage. Crippling Darkness's ability as a darkness skill to be able to apply stun to targets, which actually feeds into Terror's passive ability to increase damage dealt to stunned targets. Necrotic Carapace is one of the few skills in your tree that legitimately generates a corpse to be able to generate Fortify for the Necromancer. And then obviously Shadow Blight key passive to be able to apply Shadow Blight stacks to eventually get your 22% critical damage source. Now while Reap will trigger anything that says when you deal damage or when you use a skill across the entire spectrum of the aspects that are available, there are two in particular that are relevant for your build that you should be aware of. The first one being the Might aspect, which will gain you an additional 20% damage reduction whenever you use this skill, meaning the base skill can grant you 15%, and then the use of this aspect will gain you an additional 20%. This made it a cornerstone mainstay on the build when pushing high Nightmare Dungeon content in the past, and continues to be relevant for any build that's looking to easily slot in a huge amount of survivability. This even goes toe-to-toe with the Harlequin Crest, which we call the Shaco, which also gives you 20% damage reduction, where instead you could use a legendary helmet with the Might aspect to effectively gain the same bonus, and then be able to rely on having very niche stats for the build that are more important for you. And while we do not directly trigger the Blighted aspect to gain an additional upwards of 180% damage whenever we trigger the Shadow Blight aspect across 10 different instances, it can hit multiple targets in an AoE, able to very quickly stack Shadow Blight stacks on any one of those monsters, meaning that we're able to very easily regain the Blighted status so we can gain access to that 6 seconds of damage bonus more easily and effectively on the build, especially in high density. With its huge list of skill triggers as well as aspect triggers with incredibly high value aspects on the build, it's easy to see why Reap would be a mainstay for most Infinimist builds. And typically, if you are leveling up, progressing, or in the early game, before you transition into a more niche, speed farm oriented, or overall faster pushing build, Reap will continue to be probably the best skill that you can have on your skill bar in the 6th slot, and it's very difficult to replace it in the late game until you have more specialized gear. Now the only downfall of Reap is that it's not a damage over time effect, something that we're typically looking to bolster, and which will become even more important for the X-Falls version of the Infinimist build, which again I consider to be the baseline of the build. But for the standard version, as well as the Black River version, Reap will continue to see use in various gameplay modes, and always be a great option to come back to if you're ever wondering how to simplify your build and be able to make piloting it more easy. Decompose actually has an incredibly unique and valuable inclusion on your skill bar, but it's mostly due to the fact that channeling skills and how they interact with Lucky Hit can be abused by perpetually spamming them as opposed to actually channeling them. On top of that, Decompose actually runs into some issues where it doesn't trigger every single Lucky Hit ability that we typically want on the build. Because of this, Decompose currently occupies a very niche use case, and depending on how the developers eventually either fix, resolve, or ultimately change this skill, will drastically affect how it can be used on this build. But the base of Decompose is fairly simple. Every 1.5 seconds while you are channeling the skill actively on a target, it will generate a corpse. As long as you're channeling the skill, you can either apply an additional 10% damage multiplier to the target, or be able to apply a very strong slow effect, although that typically doesn't get used in any iteration of the build that I've personally piloted. Decompose is considered a damage over time ability, meaning that it can proc X-Falls for you, which again is actually specifically better while you're spamming the skill, sadly meaning that the base skill cannot ever channel for long enough to generate a corpse. And because of, again, a very specific interaction with Hued Flesh where it doesn't actually trigger that passive ability, you effectively can never generate corpses if you're using Decompose to its best ability to be able to trigger X-Falls. But if you are channeling the skill and generating corpses, you still cannot benefit from Hued Flesh. But that does not mean that this skill is of no use, and in fact I was actually using it for pushing high Nightmare dungeons when I was looking to make as many X-Falls procs as possible, and to be able to increase the single target damage of Infinimist, which sadly is definitely its weakest point, but in Season 2 has been drastically increased with the inclusion of the unique ring. It being a darkness skill which deals shadow damage similarly procs a lot of the things inside of our skill tree in many different aspects, like Reap would, but it is more of a backloaded corpse generation tool, whereas Reap generates a corpse the moment that you use it, Decompose will not generate a corpse until 1.5 seconds into its total channel. That being said, it does generate more corpses per second at a faster rate than Reap does, which does mean that it can be used as a really good tool against bosses, where generating corpses against a single target is typically harder for the build. Similar to Reap, Decompose will trigger the vast majority of passive skills that we have in this skill tree, but again, most notably, it does not trigger Hued Flesh. You can actually watch the video that I'll link right here, where I go over a lot of the very interesting niche use cases of Decompose on the build and as they relate to Lucky Hit. But sadly, for whatever reason, even though the base skill can generate corpses, it cannot trigger Hued Flesh to be able to generate additional corpses, whereas Reap can. So even the argument where, oh, because it typically generates corpses, they didn't want to double down on it, that logic just falls through the grates when we look at any other skill that the Necromancer has. But to be able to run through the list quickly, I won't belabor any of the points here, it can trigger Enhanced Decrepify as well as Abhorrent Decrepify, Reaper's Pursuit, Gloom, Crippling Darkness, and then Terror, Necrotic Carapace, as well as Shadow Blight key passive. Again, similarly to Reap, the Decompose skill can both trigger Might for an additional 20% damage reduction, as well as be able to easily tick up Blighted for 180% damage bonus. What's interesting about Decompose is it actually has two different aspects that are specifically slated for it. The first being Rotting, which allows Decompose to go from a single target ability to be able to target up to 3 total targets, meaning that you can be channeling simultaneously on all 3 of them, tripling how much essence generation there is, tripling how many corpses are generated, and tripling how many monsters are being affected by damage over time, as well as having multiple instances of darkness skills apply shadow damage to them. Rotting also says anytime that Decompose would naturally generate a corpse, you have up to a 60% chance of generating a corpse at that same target, meaning that every 1.5 seconds against 3 targets, you could actually be generating 6 corpses, making Decompose an incredibly enticing skill to be able to use for some of the Black River variants or things that are looking to over-generate in corpses per second. And while you may say, hey, that's the keystone, why are you not recommending this all the time? Remember that Infinimist is trying to be inside of Blood Mist near 100% of the time. It's the entire conceit of the build. That's why automating as many systems as possible is ultimately what we're looking to achieve. Decompose in this instance requires us to be out of Blood Mist so that we can be channeling Decompose. And while it's not typically a deal breaker in a lot of different scenarios, as a lot of people have noticed in higher tier dungeons, as well as harder content like the Abattoir of Zir in Season 2, just kind of standing around and channeling isn't always the best position to be in the build. It doesn't mean that it's a non-starter, but it is something to consider before you automatically slot this into your version of the build. And then along with the rotting aspect, we actually have the resource aspect of flesh rending. This says that you can generate up to 40 essence per corpse generated from Decompose. And yes, if you are decomposing against 3 targets, that means that you will minimum generate 120 essence every 1.5 seconds. And because of this, Decompose actually allows us to build into a very specific and niche version of Immortal Necromancer, a version of the build that I've never actually put out to the public because it's ultimately not good, but it sure is immortal. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is one of the sillier things that you can do on the build. And you may be asking, why did I not point out this same thing with Reap? And it's mostly because Decompose is uniquely positioned to be able to empower this very specific interaction. Decompose, when using flesh rending to be able to generate essence per corpse generated, as well as using rotting to be able to generate multiple corpses and be able to target multiple enemies simultaneously, means that you can actually generate enough essence per second to be able to rely on the Melted Heart of Selig, a specific defensive item that says that effectively your maximum essence becomes an additional shield for you, similar to your barrier generation. As long as you're able to continuously make enough essence to be able to offset the damage that you're taking in, you can then employ very specific scenarios like the injured status to be able to gain access to a huge amount of additional damage reduction. Now, while this particular system that you're looking at right now is actually slightly desynchronous or desynergistic with that particular playstyle of the injured status, you do not have to use that to be able to use the Melted Heart of Selig. You can instead just rely on your additional essence generation to act as an additional barrier source. Now, if you can't see immediately why it's desynergistic, it is because Black River, the item, says that you will gain life every single time that you kill a monster, meaning that it's very difficult to be able to maintain the injured status, and in part dismantling this megazord of a combination of unique items. Ignoring that particular hiccup in the plan, what you can still rely on is actually the Grim Harvest passive that says every single time that you consume a corpse, you're going to regain some essence. And since Black River says that we consume 5 corpses every single time that we consume 1 corpse, Decompose effectively now says every 1.5 seconds generate 6 corpses minimum, and then Ring of the Sacrilegious Souls says that every 1 second automatically cast Corpse Explosion. What it effectively means is that by putting these 3 things together and just holding down the Decompose button, you can every second reliably consume upwards of 5 corpses, automatically dropping a huge Corpse Explosion damage source while simultaneously generating over 150 essence per 1.5 seconds, and be able to completely offset any damage that you would be taking through the use of Melted Heart of Selig. Now, this overinvestment in survivability ultimately is not incredibly valuable on an Infinimist build, which, remember, is attempting to be in Blood Mist upwards of 100% of the time, and in Blood Mist you are completely immune to damage. In certain scenarios against single targets, or in scenarios where you're not able to maintain 100% uptime on your Blood Mist cooldown, this is technically an option that you can put together, and I thought that it was important enough to bring it up so that people can get a better understanding of the depth of versatility and utility that the Infinimist package can bring to a build just by including a single generator skill on your skill bar, 1 uber unique that you typically wouldn't run on the build, and then basically the original assortment of aspects and gear setup that you would typically be using. So while Decompose doesn't currently see mainstream use, I have been messing around with it, theory crafting and testing different hypothetical situations within which Decompose would actually slot into the build to some varying levels of success. It does make for an incredibly powerful single target skill spam to be able to bring down bosses more quickly, especially in Season 2, where we can abuse certain effects that would give us a 100% chance to crit from the vampiric powers. Can be used for bringing down incredibly tanky elite monsters, and again has some pretty interesting and niche uses and combinations of certain unique items that could absolutely pave the way for some new evolution of the build, depending on how the developers continue to balance the skills, bring changes to the game, and ultimately implement new items and new aspects. But if you're first venturing into playing an Infinimist Necromancer or a returning vet looking for the newest tech, at this point I would be ranking Reap above Decompose between the 2 skills that we've seen thus far. New skill, new costume, new day of recording, but let's go ahead and get into Blight, the first spender skill on the Infinimist variants that you might have seen become popularized, especially in Season 2. You're effectively able to cast this as often as you need to be able to benefit from the 6 seconds of additional damage multiplier that you can get from one of its modifiers, as well as stacking on a huge amount of additional lucky hit chance, in addition to the damage over time pool which is left over, which helps to propagate all of our lucky hit mechanics as well as damage multipliers and skill multipliers. The initial hit of Blight deals damage in an area around it, and it leaves behind a pool of damage over time, allowing you to stack even higher than the 10 Corpse Explosion stack limit to get as many damage over time effects on a single target as possible. Add on to that the fact that our essence generation on the build, although passive, is more than robust enough to be able to continuously cast Blight as often as you want, but even just casting the skill once every 6 seconds to gain access to the damage multiplier as well as the additional slow, which is really beneficial for being able to stagger bosses, means that you can weave in Blights in between Corpse Explosions if the current ticking mass has not hit that critical point where Corpse Explosion and Hued Flesh has gone infinite, but also gives you more tools for proactively staggering, generating corpses, and adding on damage to be able to speed up portions of tanky fights. Blight also works as an incredible crowd control tool with some of the aspects that we're going to see in just a moment, allowing you to interweave it as a pseudo step-in for Corpse Tendrils whenever that's on cooldown, allowing you to really control the battlefield around you. Blight being a darkness Darkness skill, which deals shadow damage, is able to trigger everything that our previous two basic generator skills were able to trigger, minus Necrotic Carapace, since Blight will not naturally generate corpses, but most notably, since the Blight skill actually applies a slow effect and then can trigger Crippling Darkness to be able to apply a stun, as well as triggering the Enhanced Decrepify to be able to apply a stun, a single cast is actually able to trigger both portions of the Terror Multiplier, getting you access to 18% additional damage when you have 3 skill ranks in it. Because Blight is a damage over time ability which has multiple instances to be able to trigger Lucky Hit, it becomes an incredibly efficient tool for activating all of these various skills and passives in our skill tree to be able to ramp up our damage as well as corpse production and cooldown reduction procs as fast as possible. The most notable addition of aspects onto this list would be the Void aspect. This says that whenever Blight were to hit a target which can be crowd controlled, you will pixel pull the target and anything else that hits within its range onto the blighted zone. Not only does this make sure that as many monsters are sitting inside of your damage over time effects as possible, but gives you a nearly cartoonish and comically effective control over monsters which can be actively crowd controlled, including elite monsters. Truly, when put into combination, the Void aspect, which is a utility aspect which can be put onto a head slot if you're not using Shaco, or even down on the boots in some severe circumstances, allows you to individually move packs of monsters together, get them into line for corpse tendrils to pull them even further, and perpetually bully them into being exactly where you want them to be. Because the pull works as a crowd control effect, and the slow from Blight also works as a crowd control effect, I'm going to skip down a few here and talk about the Umbral aspect, which says you can generate up to 4 essence every single time a crowd control effect is applied to a target. This means that with anywhere between like 2 to 4 monsters at a minimum, depending on how effectively you can crowd control them with these effects, you can infinitely spam Blight for no essence cost, since it will immediately refill the entirety of its cost, even if you only have a single source of essence cost reduction on an amulet or on boots. This is why we say that Blight is an amazing crowd control tool for survivability as well as maximizing damage output, but even just for applying as many stagger instances onto a boss as quickly as possible if you're trying to get bosses into the staggered status so that you can then apply all of your crowd control based damage multipliers and effects. Blight continues to be an amazingly powerful tool for being able to tick up blighted stacks to be able to get your damage multiplier as fast as possible, again for the initial damage instance as well as the damage over time, which you can stack on targets. And then as a great defensive tool as well, and similarly for disobedience, being able to stack as many damage over time effects on as many targets as possible, as well as crowd controlling them all into one area, means that you're very easily able to maintain your additional armor stacks. And then lastly, probably the most valuable use of Blight on the build is for being able to trigger X-Fall's Ring. You're going to see this time and time again, but with the base version of Infinimist looking to stack as many damage over time effects for Lucky Hit procs of this ring's base damage, you can see why Blight would be an immediate and very powerful include on the build's toolkit. Again, having a great base Lucky Hit chance, being able to benefit from every single stat on the ring itself, and then being able to add on more damage over time stacks on top of all of your Corpse Explosion and your Ultimate Shadow with Bone Storm. But being able to add on this additional triggering skill and damage multiplier helps to get the most out of X-Falls, especially on big tanky bosses where you were either running out of corpses, running dry on corpses, or in general finding it difficult to Zerg bosses down. Our second spender skill is Sever, and while I really love this skill and ultimately end up testing it and playing around with it every single season, it typically ends up evolving just into a Sever Necromancer skill, but that does not mean that Sever doesn't have a place on this build as a very niche and interesting total generator for corpses, as well as shadow damage procs, and ultimately a ton of damage over time as well, with the use of one very specific unique pair of boots. But at face value, what Sever brings to the table is 4 damage instances in an AoE on any target of your choice or any pack of monsters that's going to deal shadow damage to each one of them. And while it is AoE damage, it is not damage over time initially, because when you cast it on a target, a scythe wielding maniac skeleton will fly out from you, dealing damage as it travels, deal damage in the area around it, deal damage as it travels back towards you, and then deal damage around you, meaning that if you are point blank standing right next to a monster, all 4 damage instances can actually overlay anything in the pack in front of you. This also makes it an incredibly good skill for being able to pinpoint apply AoE damage to an area further away from you, or leave damage behind you as you move on. On top of that, Sever actually has an incredibly valuable source of vulnerable procs as well. Even with the addition of the Sacrilegious Ring, it's actually pretty difficult to have 100% uptime on vulnerable, especially outside of Season 2 when we don't have the Vampiric Curse and Prey on the Weak. That means that being able to permanently maintain this additional source of damage multiplication and additive damage on all of our sources, as well as trigger anything that requires the target to be vulnerable for it to be active, generally increases the value of Sever on the build and brings it very far out of the meme status and into a very useful tool for people to consider using, coupled with its incredibly low essence cost, meaning that you don't really have to do anything else to be able to empower it or be able to run its engine itself. You kind of just spam it whenever you want. With its multiple damage instances in an AoE around it every single cast, it's incredibly valuable for being able to generate a ton of additional corpses, for being able to clear out density, and even though it has a low lucky hit chance, we're able to bolster up how many damage instances we're able to get out of this skill at any given time to be able to make up for quality with pure quantity. And while I should have said this during the Blight section, you never actually invest more than a single point into either Sever or Blight. You are just looking to get that base instance of damage activation and skill use, because ultimately none of your damage is coming from them. They're only there to help facilitate the damage of the rest of your kit. Sever, just like Blight, as well as the first 2 generator skills that we showed, is able to trigger every single one of the passive skills in our skill tree that are valuable to us. The most notable difference here for Sever is that it doesn't initially apply any slow or stun effect, so it's only able to proc the terror stun effect from either enhanced decrepify procs as well as crippling darkness stun procs. Outside of that, it doesn't have any unique interactions with our skill tree, so I won't belabor the point. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't discuss the Empowering Reaper aspect on the build, but I do want to put this forewarning up right now. While the benefit of this aspect is pretty interesting and allows us to basically double dip on how effective Sever can be on our build without needing more skills on our skill bar. But as it stands right now, the Infinimist Necromancer as it currently exists does not have any space on the build to be able to add an additional offensive aspect. With that forewarning right there, basically meaning that I don't currently recommend this in any way, shape, or form. I do want to talk about it because it could evolve into something that would be very useful. Empowering Reaper says that you have up to a 30% chance to be able to cast Blight on a target that has been hit by Sever. That means that without needing it on your skill bar, you could put the 3 points into Blight, applying it slow and then also its damage multiplier from its modifiers, and then effectively free cast Blight on top of Sever for the purposes of being able to get the benefits of both of these skills for the cheap cost of just Sever itself. While it can only happen once every 3 seconds, Blight lasts for 6 seconds, and you should almost certainly be able to trigger this 30% chance, especially since we're a very high lucky hit chance build, very easily during that time to be able to have constant overlapping Blight. What this means is that Sever, in addition to the unique interaction that I'm going to show you in just a second, would be able to also apply a damage over time effect on top of its AoE damage effects, be able to effectively double dip on lucky hit triggers. Again, while we can't currently fit it onto the build, it is on the radar as something that could bring a lot of additional utility and might ultimately be one of the best overall tools for the build if the Necromancer somehow gets an additional item slot, or they change what type of aspect it is, or drastically change how the aspect system works in general. Outside of that, the only aspects that Sever really works with well is both Blighted and Disobedience for the same reason. It deals damage in AoE, and it hits multiple targets per cast. Add on to that the Greaves of the Empty Tomb in the unique section will add on an additional damage over time ability to be able to stack these even more quickly, making Sever an incredibly powerful tool for being able to maintain maximum uptime on all of these buffs, and will typically outperform the majority of other skills that you could have in this same slot. Now, Sever has a very specific unique set of boots the Greaves of the Empty Tomb, which add on a particularly interesting sub-effect of casting Sever, which allows you to trigger a constellation of effects, but most notably a special rare glyph by the name of Desecration in our Paragon system, as well as X-Files Ring itself. Now, what Greaves of the Empty Tomb say is that every time that you cast Sever, it leaves behind an area of desecrated ground wherever it travels. So as it travels out and as it travels back in, this desecrated ground will last for 5 seconds, and it has its own keyword of desecrated ground. Not only will it be multiplied by the bonuses by the glyph Desecration, although that realistically is not a sizable or useful amount of damage for the build, but what it most notably does is say whenever you are standing on top of desecrated ground, gain a 15% damage multiplier. But because Sever now leaves behind 2 overlapping systems of damage over time, the skill can now trigger X-Files Ring, considering that is triggered off of damage over time effects, which Sever has gained access to. And while I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, I do want to point out these damage over time effects are then able to trigger all of our lucky hit abilities like Hewed Flesh, as well as Abhorrent Decrepify. So not only will Sever be able to generate corpses off of the initial cast, both of the travel damage instances and the return damage instance, but is now overlaying 2 5-second damage over time abilities, which will tick and apply lucky hit chance at the rate of Sever itself, gaining you additional corpses, gaining you additional cooldown reduction procs, as well as being able to trigger damage over time abilities, be able to trigger terror, as well as triggering gloom in our passive tree, stacking up Shadow Blight even more quickly, being able to add up the blighted aspect more quickly, and then in addition to that, the cherry on top, having another source to be able to trigger the X-Files Ring damage itself. But even just being able to trigger your ring more actively with the Sever skill, as well as empowering more of your overall engine, it's easy to see why Sever, although seemingly niche and nearly meme in stature, can actually be a formidable option in the 6th skill slot. Y'all ain't ready for this one. No, but seriously, I was going to have an entire section that covers over Bone Spirit in the weird way that you can kind of empower it through using Blighted, but to get the big damage multiplier. And then basically come out of Blood Mist, cast Bone Spirit and blow everything up, go back into Blood Mist, and play this weird version of Submarine Necromancer. The reality is that would actually be its own video where I'd have to explain so many new nuances to how it all works that at the end of the day, I'm not really explaining Infinimist in a way that's valuable for you. So look forward to the Bone Spirit Infinimist Submarine Necro build guide at some point in the future, when I have enough free time to be able to make a video guide about a Submarine Necromancer build. All right, back to the actual skills that you need to learn about. The skill Decrepify serves a very specific purpose on this build, and we haven't really seen it bloom into its own until the addition of the Abattoir of Zir content, incredibly difficult, challenging content that required us to be able to multiply our damage to the utmost extreme at the end of Season 2. And while there are some interesting interactions with Iron Maiden, most notably the things it doesn't actually interact with, it is purely for the addition of both curses on your skill bar to be able to activate the damned aspect to gain an additional 50% damage multiplier, specifically for our shadow damage. Utilizing this skill requires you to completely abandon the ability to proc X-Files more effectively using any of the spender skills, as well as generate corpses proactively with any of the generator skills. So there's not a lot to really cover in this point, but I will go over things that are important for you to understand. At the end of the day, Decrepify effectively says nothing for our build. It adds on a small amount of damage that doesn't act like Thorn's damage whenever a monster successfully attacks you. Its enhancement makes it so it doesn't cost essence at all, so you can use it to count as a skill spam for the purposes of things like healing per skill use, and then with Temerity Pants for overhealing and barrier. And then to further bolster that, whenever a monster dies, you will heal for a small amount. But like I said, the skill doesn't really have a lot going for it, so let's just very quickly get through the rest of the things that you need to know. Then as far as what Decrepify triggers in our skill tree, it's really just one thing, and that's amplified damage, which says if a target is cursed, you deal more damage to it. And I have a second note here, which is that it doesn't trigger anything else, which is incredibly weird. Just to make sure I had the most up-to-date and best information to give to you, I went to specifically test an interaction where Iron Maiden, which for all intents and purposes should be acting exactly like Thorn's damage. A monster attacks you, they receive an amount of damage based off of your weapon damage and relevant multipliers. If you are unaware, Thorn's damage will trigger Abhorrent Decrepify as well as Enhanced Decrepify for the purposes of stunning and reducing cooldowns. Now, interestingly enough, Thorn's damage will not trigger Hewed Flesh. On top of all of this, Iron Maiden doesn't trigger any of these things. It doesn't trigger Decrepify, it doesn't trigger Abhorrent Decrepify, it doesn't trigger Hewed Flesh, it just does instances of damage that are for whatever reason not recognized as you doing damage or you hitting the target. Add on top of that, the damage that Decrepify deals is physical damage, which doesn't then go and interact with any of the passives that we have further on in our skill tree. And what it basically just means is that Decrepify just does what it says on the tin, and that's it. Now, the entire reason why you use Iron Maiden is to activate the aspect Damned. This offensive aspect says that if you have Decrepify as well as Iron Maiden on the target simultaneously, they will take 50% increased shadow damage. You can put it on a two-hander, you can put it on an amulet to boost it even further. But what this basically allows us to do is take up one of the offensive aspect slots on Infinimist that typically gets used for utility or mobility in the forms of Blood-Soaked or Ultimate Shadow, and swap it over to this for a larger total damage multiplier. And I cannot stress this enough, as it stands right now with the content that's in the game, other than the Abattoir of Zir or whatever it morphs into in future seasons as evergreen content, is the only place where this is legitimately relevant and would offset the loss of utility, mobility, and otherwise more normalized damage output from any of the other skills that you could put in this slot. But it is very important to note that this tool is available if in the future we are looking for additional multipliers to be able to slot onto the build. Now, interestingly enough, we can make it so that Iron Maiden serves some purpose with the addition of the utility aspect Torturous. It says that if a target has Iron Maiden on them and successfully deals instances of damage, there's a chance that they will become stunned. We can technically fit this either onto the helmet or the boots if you don't care about mobility, or if you don't need to stack on an additional defensive option. What it means is that we gain an additional ability to be able to apply stagger to a boss, especially bosses that have damage over time or AoE damage effects, and then also be able to apply additional instances of stun to elite monsters to either crowd control them better or get them into the unstoppable state more quickly to be able to trigger things like Exploiter's aspect to be able to gain even more damage bonuses. Now, I hinted to a reality where you can kind of use the healing from Iron Maiden to be able to benefit from barrier generation on temerity, and I would make a whole slide for that, but that's kind of the end of the road for that concept as well, and I don't legitimately recommend that as any alternative to the already fantastic barrier generation options that Infinimist has. For the final option in this skill slot, we actually look to raise Skeleton, because it turns out if Infinimist is one of the best lucky hit, if not the best lucky hit builds in the entirety of the game, it works incredibly well with the unique item Ring of Mendeln, which seeks to proc lucky hit so that your skeletons can be a vessel to apply a bunch of huge AoE damage that all scales off of the Necromancer themselves. To be able to use this ring, we have to have Raised Skeleton on our skill bar, and funnily enough, it's actually very easy to fit the Mendeln package in with Infinimist. This is a variant on both of the build guides, both the Shadow Summoner and the Infinimist Necromancer, that I've had on max roll going on a very long time now, since Season 1. The skill itself requires you to consume corpses to be able to summon skeletons. These typically come in the form of the Reapers, since the Reapers are going to be able to generate corpses for us, although in Season 2 that's been borked a little bit, as well as either the Shadow Mages for being able to tick up Shadow Blight and be able to benefit from our Shadow passives, or to be able to use the Cold Mages for applying more instances of crowd control and vulnerable. Regardless of which skeletons are used, you basically need to pump out as many of them as quickly as possible, trigger lucky hit as often as possible, so that you get these huge explosion damage from the Ring of Mendeln proc itself, which again, as a very important note, does not scale off of the skeletons themselves, so we do not care about their damage in any way. They just need to be tanky enough to survive, and luckily, since the Infinimist Necromancer doesn't care as much about defensive stats on the gear for themselves, it's actually very easy to slot in plus to minion maximum life, and then to be able to empower them slightly through a very limited Paragon board investment, while primarily still relying on the actual base damage of the Infinimist Necromancer themselves. And then in a very small way, you can actually use this and X-Falls together, but I found in general that was worse than just strictly running X-Falls or just strictly running Mendeln. The skill tree interactions with Ray's skeleton and the implications of them are slightly more convoluted than you may think of after a first pass. Most notably, it'll proc both Grim Harvest as well as Fueled by Death, since using Ray's skeleton is considered a corpse consumption mechanic. Specifically when using the Reaper skeleton, since they generate corpses on attack, that will trigger Necrotic Carapace and generate Fortify. Both Gloom and Terror's bonus damage actually work for your Shadow Mage's shadow damage as well, although that damage is ultimately something that is of little consequence. Most notably, you will be losing both the standalone bonuses as well as the Memento Mori bonuses from sacrificing these skeletons in the first place. So you will be losing more damage reduction than you typically would expect if you were to also actually invest in their survivability on your own gear. And then you're also going to be losing a multiplier of shadow damage or critical strike chance depending on your variant, as well as an additional multiplier for vulnerable damage. Interestingly enough, both Enhanced Decrepify as well as Abhorrent Decrepify can actually be triggered by a small amount of the minion's base attacks. So in this case, a Skirmisher's base attack doesn't trigger these abilities, but the Reaper Skeleton's attacks do, as well as the Defender Skeletons do, and then a smattering of the Mage's skills will also apply to this. But Thorn's damage inherited by your skeletons will also trigger these effects for you, although they will not trigger Hued Flesh in any way, shape, or form. Now, if you've been following along this entire time, I typically would have gone over the aspects which are triggered by your skeletons. In reality, there are no special aspects which empower the rest of the Infinimist build, or actually empower the Mendeln aspect of this build either. While you will have to use the aspects that say that you gain more skeletons on use in 2 of your different utility slots, I didn't think that warranted an entire slide because that's kind of self-explanatory. Ring of Mendeln's base stats will actually serve 3 incredibly important purposes on the build. 1, giving you additional lucky hit to be able to give you the best chance of proccing this very low coefficient of the base effect itself, which is only 10%. It'll also give you maximum minion life to make it easier for them to survive, a stat that would typically be very difficult to get except on your pants and also on your chest piece. And then lastly, giving you access to Thorn's damage, which again can trigger the lucky hit effects for Abhorrent Decrepify, which is incredibly important for managing all of your cooldowns, since you can't rely on the typical skill in this slot to be able to further empower that aspect of the build itself. But talking about the actual effect of the Ring of Mendeln, very simply what it does is cause your skeletons to become little stat sticks that apply this effect for you. When you successfully trigger this lucky hit, each one of your skeletons will apply a small AoE damage effect on their next attack. The damage of this effect is based off of the Necromancer itself and is not modified by any stats that modify your minion's damage. They are effectively not responsible for this effect at all, except for actually applying it. That's why I refer to them as stat sticks. The damage from Mendeln is dealt as physical damage, so it won't benefit from any of our shadow damage increases, but it still benefits from Blighted aspect, which just increases all damage that you deal for that 6 seconds. This is why the Ring of Mendeln is typically built as a critical strike version of the build, so you need to be using Grasping Veins to get additional crit chance as well as crit damage against your target, and prioritize those crit stats similar to the X-Falls Necromancer, and again, why it's so easy to actually slot this onto the Infinimist version of the build, because a lot of the gear and stats that you need are already there. You just need to swap out some of the aspects, and then you literally just swap the X-Falls ring for the Mendeln ring. Now, what this does mean is that a lot of the investment into shadow damage that you would typically do on this build is going to fall by the wayside, and you ultimately actually want to invest in alternative damage sources unless you are still putting enough points for your corpse explosion damage to be relevant, which is fairly easy to do. But that being said, similar to the X-Falls version of the Infinimist build, we really don't care about the corpse explosion damage typically to be able to maximize our crit damage and the additive damages that will actually work for this source. All in all, the Mendeln version of an Infinimist build is a huge trade-off and ultimately revolves around similar concepts and theories, but is played differently and rewards the players differently for how the gameplay loop works in this instance. I would say out of all of the options that you could put into your 6 skills slot, Raised Skeleton with Ring of Mendeln is definitely going to transform the build in the most noticeable way, but you'll find that after playing it for a good amount of time, how similar and almost eerily representative of the base Infinimist experience that the build ultimately is. For those of you who made it to this point in the video, what I ultimately hope I've done is allowed you to empower yourself to be able to make the decisions about how you are going to build your own Infinimist Necromancer, or at the very least gave you all of the tools that you need to be able to dissect the options that people are using, checking out build guides, and ultimately coming to your own conclusions. If you're somebody who watched all of this, or maybe just skipped down to this part, and are asking the question, which one of these skills is the best? I have 2 answers for you. I have the real answer, which is just my opinion, and it comes down to how I play the game, and then I have the more froofy answer, which is ultimately what you would expect at some point like this, and it really comes down to how you want to play the build. Reap is by far the tankiest option, allowing you to add on additional damage reduction and have corpses on demand more regularly. Decompose is this interesting niche option that ultimately might just be bugged, but allows you to proc out a huge amount of X-falls while secretly tacking on all of these weird techs that you can implement. Blight is without question the highest damage increasing option here for the build, while Sever, a little bit of a sleeper agent, is going to add on a lot more engaging and interactive gameplay that pulls you a little bit away from the Infinimist paradigm, but allows you to be more proactive in how you play the game and will probably hold your attention better. Decrepify is for tryhards that are looking to max out as many damage multipliers as possible, while ultimately sacrificing a lot of what makes the engine consistent and can tend to burn out. So it's a high risk, high reward option. And then Mendeln with Raised Skeleton allows you to shift over to a more classic Necromancer summoner experience. And I think ultimately is the closest thing that we currently have to the true summon Necromancer, as far as your opinion comes down on whether or not using a ring to proc damage from the Necromancer themselves is a summon Necromancer. Now, as for myself, while I'm progressing through the game, leveling and getting my gear together, I always use Reap since it is so consistent and allows you to rely on the engine to be at your beck and call when you need it. But what I ultimately end up swapping over to is Blight as the best endgame option. And there you go. You have the play it how you want answer and you have my opinion answer. But thank you so much for watching this video. I know that it was a big one, and if you haven't noticed, I tried to really amp up the overall production value and the editing value and just make this the best possible video that I could. And after the week or 2 that I've been working on it, I'm glad that I can finally put it out there. While I initially thought I was going to include every single skill in the rest of the skill bar in this video, there's just no way to fit it in. This thing's already close to an hour, and that's absolutely ridiculous. So look forward to part 3 or part 2B, whatever you want to call it, where I'm going to go over the rest of the skills on the skill bar so that you understand what the rest of the engine of this build does, so that you can choose which one of these to slot in more easily. If you're new to the channel, please go ahead and subscribe to it if you enjoyed this content. We absolutely smashed 2023. I actually quadrupled the size of this YouTube channel in less than a year, and I'm hoping to continue that growth moving into 2024, bringing you this higher quality video style, putting in more time and effort into what I'm creating, and hopefully you all get to reap the benefits of the work that I'm putting in. Likewise, if you can throw a like on the video as well as commenting down below, I would love to hear from you in things that you want me to be able to cover in the upcoming videos, things that you thought I didn't cover well enough here, or you were looking for additional information or details. A lot of people were commenting on the last video with all the different things that they were kind of hoping would be in this one. And interestingly enough, whether it's fate or whatever you want to call it, a lot of that stuff was already in my head rattling around, and I'm glad that people showed interest, so I knew really what to touch on here so that they were getting the information that they needed. So go ahead and leave a comment, leave a like on the video, subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps you enjoy this game to the best capacity that you possibly can. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.